I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to another edition of Conversations with Al McFarlane. This is our special Black History Month series. We're doing around 10, 12 interviews over a couple of weeks, interviews with leaders, elders, and young people in the community who talk about what civil rights means to them, their story, their personal story, their family story, their professional story. But we're focusing on contemplating the notion of civil rights, what it means for our community and for humanity. This series is brought to you by Comcast of the Twin Cities. Today's program is one that I'm especially happy to do, meeting with a person that I've known for a long time, leader, elder, visionary, and an accomplished, storied, legendary leader in the community, Debbie Montgomery. Debbie Montgomery was the first female police officer in the St. Paul Police Department. She also is a former St. Paul City Council member. She also was Assistant Commissioner for Public Safety for the state of Minnesota. When I heard her present last year in one of the programs that Comcast sponsored on Voices of Civil Rights, she talked about her history with the NAACP. And I thought I knew her, but I learned so much more that night about your coming up as a fighter and as an organizer and as a doer in the NAACP in St. Paul. First of all, Debbie, thank you and welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and it's my honor to be part of your series.
Well, thank you so much. You know, the first question I ask is, just when I say the words civil rights, what thoughts come to mind? What does it mean to you? How do you internalize that?
Well, it's a journey. When I think of the movement and the journey that I had and was blessed to be part of with the NAACP, and having the opportunity to sit down and with leaders that in our community today are esteemed leaders, the Roy Wilkins, the Margaret Bush Wilson, Thurgood Marshall, to sit at the table with them on the board of the National Organization of Black in AACP, and to listen to the discussions and how are we going to get these laws passed and how are we going to be included into the American society in a respectable way. The fact that we built this country on our backs and yet are being disenfranchised. And so that was a journey that I took with them. And as I said during the other program, I sat there for 6 years on the national board, and we wrote 470 laws. And after 6 years, I was so disgusted as a young person because we had passed all these laws. They were all on the books, but nobody was enforcing them. And I said, what is this all about? And then I said, I've got to become more active. It's one thing to have the laws, but how do we get people to participate and to engage and to make sure that the laws that are on the books are being enforced and that our community is growing through this experience? And so that's one of the things that I worked through on my journey. You know, I was as involved with the March on Washington in 1963.
How old were you then?
17.
17, okay.
17.
All right.
And I was, as I said, I was on a journey because there was a busload of people, Josie Johnson, Matt Little and them, and they had a bus, and we didn't have the money for me to get on the bus. And yet my grandfather, I was raised by my grandparents, he worked for the railroad. And so they had passes, so and I used all of his passes all the time. Anyway, he put me on the train, and so the porter had me, and they made sure they put me in the food room. You know, young people like to eat. And, you know, fed me and kept an eye on me and made sure I was okay. Took me to Chicago. In Chicago, he turned me over to a porter on the train to go to Baltimore. As I was on the train going to Baltimore and listening to the stories from the porters on their breaks on what they had went through and learning and growing on those experiences. And then when I got to Baltimore, had to wait for the porters to clean the trains. And then he said, I'll take you over to the mall. We got on a bus and took the bus over to the mall. And as I look today, I always say if you point to the back of the reflective pond, that's where I was at.
Ah.
So I can see it today, and listening to that great speech of Dr. King, and being engaged, and just, I mean, just the thrill of being there with 250,000 people. And,
That had to be phenomenal.
oh my God, and emotional.
I remember I was maybe 15 in hospital in Kansas City, Missouri, and I watched the march from a hospital bed, having knee surgery from football, right? And but just the power of that gathering of people, and as you said, the phenomenal singing of, I think it was the great gospel singer. I'm trying to get her name. Her name is slipping me right now.
Yeah,
But anyway, and then Dr. King's speeches and all of them, just a powerful
Yes.
moment.
Yes.
And it's one that made you sort of commit and rededicate and know why it's important to fight, I believe.
Right. You know, coming from Minnesota and northern
Mahalia
states.
Jackson.
Yeah, Mahalia.
Yeah, right.
Coming from Minnesota, you know, I mean, you know, to hear the struggles, as I'm standing there with people that came up from Mississippi and Alabama, and the struggles that they were going through. And don't misunderstand me, as you and I know, the struggles that were up here in Minnesota, they may have been a little different in the intensity, but they were still the same.
That's right.
And so just to get that emotion and the feeling and the love of this country that these people had, it was just very emotional. And it did a lot for me to inspire me. And when I came back and started at the university, you know, that was one of the things, because Matt Stark was in charge of CURA, Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, and got involved with that. And we just really engaged in civic duty and how to commit from the university's point of view.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane, our special Black History Month programming. We're talking to leaders, elders, and community about civil rights. Now, if you like this kind of content, I'm going to ask you to like the program, to share it with your networks, and also to follow this program on social media. We want to broaden the circle and expand this conversation. It's an important conversation. My guest is Debbie Montgomery. Debbie Montgomery was the first female police officer for the St. Paul Police Department. She is also a former member of St. Paul City Council, and she, for a number of years, had a state position as Assistant Commissioner for the Department of Public Safety. So you're at the university,
Right.
and you're trying to decide which way to go, what your career options are going to be. How did you end up becoming a police officer?
Well, that was kind of a strange journey. I was in the political science sociology as my and then in the Humphrey Institute I was an urban planner, urban law, and social gerontology was my background. And so I was a city planner for the city, and I was an administrative assistant for Mayor Larry Cohen. And in 1971, there was a court injunction put up by the NAACP because they had 600 police officers and they only had 4 African Americans. 6% of the population was African American. And so the NAACP sued the St. Paul Police Department. And Miles Lord, who was the Attorney General at the time, told them that when they hired, they had to hire a percentage of African Americans. Well, the union at that time said, you know, we ain't hiring any of them. And so from 71 to 74, they didn't hire because they weren't going to, you know, let them hire any. And in 1974, it became a life safety issue. So they had posted for 50, and Miles Lord said 10 of the 50 had to be African American. And so they posted it. 2,000 people signed up for it, 450 women at that time, which was very interesting. And Ron Jones said to me, I hadn't signed up for the test. Ron Jones said, Debbie, I need you to sign up for the test because you're the only woman I know that can pass it, because it was the West Point Military Physical Agility Test that was part of it. And women didn't get, this is 1974, and women didn't get into West Point until 1976, and they had to change that requirement. But anyway, there was a civil service test, and I did extremely well on that. And there was a background, defensive driving, all these other tests that they had. And then they they had this physical agility test. You had to run 5 miles. You had to do these obstacle courses, get over a 6-foot wall, hop a 4-foot fence, climb up into a cylinder that had a hole cut for 6-foot men and get out of it. And you had to do it in a timed course. And having been a jock in my younger days, I was able to do it. And at the end of the testing period, I was the only woman out of 450 women that passed.
Amazing.
And only 8 men had done better than I had. And so, there's a letter in my file saying thank you for the opportunity to take the test, but no thanks, I don't want the job. It was a $10,000 cut in pay. I had a master's degree, and you only needed a GED back then. And so I go back to my office to do my job, and I get a call from the mayor because the Friday before the academy is supposed to start, the mayor calls me because one of the 10 African-American men that was in the academy decided to drop out, in the process decided to drop out, and they couldn't start without 10. And the only person on the list that the mayor had control of was me, and he said, I needed you to take a leave and go sit in this academy for me for 2 weeks so we can get it started. And I said, well, who's going to make up this $10,000 cut in pay? Don't worry, you'll be taken care of. You got to watch trusting those politicians. And so anyway, on that Saturday, they're rushing me down to Uniforms Unlimited to get fitted for a uniform. And at that time, they had a height requirement of 6 feet tall, and I was 5'6"3/4. So they're trying to take this men's uniform and cut it down, cutting the sleeves, cutting the tails. Women have a little posterior, so they had to add some to the pants. And they're hurrying up trying to get this uniform ready for me so that I can be in the academy on Monday morning. And so we go to the academy on Monday morning. I get called into the captain's office, and he says, well, I just want you to know you're getting no special privileges. Well, I didn't know what a special privilege was.
Right.
I was just trying to show up and do what was asked, because in my mind, I'm only going to be there a couple of weeks. So we had law tests, which obviously I had done extremely well on those. And then we had defensive tactics and other courses that we had to take, how to shoot a gun and defensive driving and just all kinds of stuff that was part of the core curriculum. And so at the written book work, I was pretty good at listening and taking good notes and figuring out what was going to be on the exam. They gave you a quiz every day. So I'd go home and I'd read. Now at this time I had 4 kids and a husband. And I'd go home and read because I had to work by myself to kind of get it. And then I'd go meet up with the African-American men, and I'd say, okay, I think these are going to be the questions on the exam. And I was usually pretty right. I usually had all 4 of the questions in the quiz, and they had the answers. So we all did well in passing the test. But it was interesting because, like I say, during the academy, we had PT, and I think of Fred Lesky, who was the defensive tactics guy. He was an old ex-Marine, and he was teaching me how to do defensive tactics and doing takedowns. And he saw I was struggling, and it was just kind of interesting because he took it upon himself to figure out and to work with me because the men were doing the takedowns with using the upper body, and women's strength is in the lower body. So he was showing me how to do takedowns using my lower body. And so that was the first person that really kind of at least was willing to work with me on some of the issues that were coming up. In the meantime, there was only one locker room, and one bathroom, the men's bathroom. So I shared a locker room with 21 men in my platoon. And after every PT, we had to go in, and the guys would move me down to get close. So when they blew the whistle for dismissal, I would go in, and I had to turn all the water on. And I took a cold shower at my 5 minutes, grabbed my uniform, went out and dressed in the classroom, while the rest of them had hot water by the time they got in there and took their shower. So
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That you found that level of cooperation. Yeah.
So yeah, it was a journey, but at the end of 2 weeks, I'm ready to come back to my position, and I get a call from the mayor, and he says, hey, Debbie, can you stay 2 more weeks? Because Miles Lord might think there's something up. And I said, well, you know, what about this salary? Don't worry, you'll be taken care of. And so I stayed 2 more weeks, and at the end of a month, I'm at the top of my academy, and I'm able to do everything that the guys are doing. And I had the average strength of a man, just the average. The rest of them may have been a lot higher.
Sure.
But I thought at the end of the 4 weeks, I said, you know, this isn't about me anymore. If I drop out now, they're going to say a woman couldn't do it. And it became a bigger issue of, you know, I got to get through this 16-week academy so that, you know, we can say that women can complete this job. And so that's what I did. And at the end of 16 weeks, I thought, you know, in the academy, you don't have bullets in your gun, and you haven't driven the car with the red lights. And I figured all the heck that I had been through, that I wanted to go through the FTO training period. And so I got into every 6 weeks. There was a 36-week FTO period. And every 6 weeks, you had a different FTO person.
What's FTO mean?
Field training officer.
Okay.
And some of mine were not very friendly or helpful. And a couple of them were. And I had one old timer who was had been a previous Detroit cop, Kenny Shepard, and he stayed on me, big muscular guy. And he stayed on me all the time because he said, I lost a partner in Detroit and I'm not going to lose one now, so you listen to what I'm telling you to do. And so we had we worked up in the projects, and we had a lot of incidents where there was conflict and fights and everything. And you know, I held my own, you know, in there, and he was always worried. I said, don't worry, you take care of yours, I'll take care of mine.
Sure,
you know?
Sure.
But it was just kind of interesting to see that. And at the end of 36 weeks, I'm thinking, okay, I'm ready to go back to my job. Well, there had been an election. There was a new mayor. My position was there, but it wasn't funded. So by default, I became a police officer. But that journey was really interesting because I'm a community person, and they had put me on Rice Street, which at that time was predominantly white, low income, and I wasn't well received. The Hells Outcasts had their headquarters there. They put me in a one-person car when every other car had 2 men in on midnights, and there was 42 bars on Rice Street in the beat that we had. And so all I talked to most of the time were drunks, derelicts, or dopers. Very seldom did I find somebody that was coming to or from work. And but one of the things that they found out through my journey is that women are good communicators. And I was able to work with my community. I was able to identify. I teach part-time. I always tell my students, make sure you've got a toolbox. And in my toolbox, I made sure that I knew people to call down at Child Protection or in juvenile, Ramsey County Juvenile Justice System, or if somebody had burglary and they had a window broken out, I always had a card with people that could come at night and repair windows and put cardboard up or put wood up on them. So I had my toolbox expanded, but you ran into people, and having lived in the Rondo neighborhood, these are people who had the same issues that we had. They were waiting for a check, you know, on the 1st of the month or the 15th, and they really were just living to try to get by. Some of them weren't bad people. They just living day to day. And, we pulled over cars, and you had a tail light out, you had a headlight out, you had defective equipment, and I'd pull them over, and you'd say, you got a tail light out, and when you hit your brakes back in the old days, the white light shined in your eyes, which was really a hazard. And so I would talk to them, and if they talked nice and they really seemed like they were concerned, I started to analyze it, and I took it upon myself to go over to Menards and get a roll of tape, red tape.
Sure. Yeah.
And I'd tell if they were acting nice, because there were those that were calling me everything but a child of God. But if they were acting nice, I'd say, well, I can't do this, but if you take this tape and cover that up, nobody will pull you over. But when can you get this fixed? Because this is just temporary. This is not going to stay on.
Right.
And they'd say, well, I get my check at the first of the month. And so I said, well, I'll come by and check and see, what you did. And it was interesting. When you put your trust in people, the majority of them did what was asked of them.
They rise to the occasion.
They rise to the occasion, and they got it fixed.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is a special Conversations with Al McFarlane, live to Facebook Live. We're broadcasting from the Marcus Garvey House in North Minneapolis. And I'm talking with Debbie Montgomery. She is the first female police officer for the City of St. Paul Police Department, a former St. Paul City Council member, and a former Assistant Commissioner for Minnesota's Department of Public Safety. Wonderful stories, and as I said before, if you like this kind of content, I invite you to like this program, to share it with your friends, your networks, and also to follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. Debbie, we're down to the last few minutes. It goes so fast already, but I wanted to have you take that experience and talk about what you've learned and how you have, in effect, through direct service, you have moved the bar, you've raised the bar in how people respect black people and how we also provide quality service to society, not only to our people, but to everybody. And you've had an exacting standard that you've held yourself to and others as well. And I think you would say that that's part of your commitment to human rights, civil rights, human dignity. What messages do you think we need to focus on now so that we'll keep moving the bar higher, moving the path more broadly towards achieving those things that we still are lacking in the area of civil and human rights?
Well, as I tell my students all the time, each one of us have different talents. And what we have to do is take the strengths that we have. I'm a good communicator, and I'm a good resource searcher. And so I like to find resources. If I see a problem, I want to find resources or someone that can help us to solve the problem. And like I say, during my time on the city council, I ran on jobs, economic development, opportunities for youth and seniors. And I partnered with the businesses community, the developers. Every project that I had that was worked on, one of the things that I made sure that we signed is that we were going to have job opportunities for people. And in my ward, I had them sign that they were going to hire first for their jobs that were available from Ward 1. And it's to put that pressure on and to give them that concern that everybody wants a job. Everyone wants to raise a family. Everyone is committed to the building of this country and this society and to our cities. And I think back to Tom Carrico from Target Corporation when they were going to build the Super Target over in St. Paul. And I said, Tom, they were going to lay the people off on the old Target. I said, well, Tom, my folks need to have a job. You can't lay them off. I said, can't you transfer them to other stores? He said, well, we don't do that. I didn't ask you what you do. I said, can't you do this? He came back and he said, well, yeah. I said, well, Tom, my folks don't have any transportation. Can't you guys provide some buses or cabs or something? He said, Debbie, we don't do. I said, Tom, you guys are a big corporation. You've got resources. You can get bus cards from MTC. I said, provide some opportunities for my folks to get to these jobs. And that's what I'm talking about. Dig in, try to identify what problems you see, and then help those that don't see that problem so that they can work on it and feel a part and that they're contributing. And by the end of the day, we hired 300 new employees on top of the ones we had transferred out. And they all had good jobs. They were thanking me, and he hired only the first 300 from Ward 1. But he said, Debbie, you were the hardest person that I've had to negotiate with. He did all the development for all the Target. And he said, but you were doing it for the right reasons.
That's right.
And those are the kinds of commitment that I have, not just to our community, but to society as a whole. People call me all the time, what can I do? Can you help me with this? And so it's just trying to network your way through and build those relationships and then those people that have the resources, try to get them to share those resources with those that have no resources.
You mentioned your grandmother, that you were raised by your grandparents. Talk for a minute about what all has poured into the making of Debbie Montgomery. What's your family history?
Well,
And talk about your children and grands.
Well, my grandmother was from Kentucky. My grandfather was from Lubbock, Texas. And, they had that southern upbringing and that family and community background. And they really brought that into me. And then they were in the old days, they were very religious. So we went to church every Sunday. And so, going to church and having that religious connection, sitting down at the table and having dinner and hearing the stories. That's one of the things we don't hear today is the storytelling, to share the things that are going on today and to try to get some insight from our parents or the people that are around the table with us to try to see how we can grow and share those issues and how can we work on them. So they brought that to me. It was a lot of love. I mean, I felt extremely well loved. I have 4 kids. 3 of them are police officers. My daughter's an investment banker. I've got 12 grandchildren, 1 great-grand. And they're all, education is a very high value for us. All of my kids went to college. 3 of them have master's degrees. Dawn Marie's got 2. But, we put a value into it. And I always share the story of my youngest son. I've got a picture of him that was in the St. Paul Dispatch, Pioneer Press, back in the day. He was 10 years old, and he was on the front page of the paper, and he's riding one of those little bike, and he's pulling a lawnmower behind him. And he had a shirt on, and it was cut halfway, and it said, I couldn't afford the other half of the shirt. But the reason that he was doing that was every one of my kids, in the summer, they had 5 seniors that their responsibility was to cut the grass of the seniors. And my husband, when he came home from work, would check it to see that the grass was cut right, and if it wasn't, they had to go back and cut it again. And the seniors could not pay my kids. That was their community service. Wow. And when I tell that story to my students, they said, you? I said, no, because you have to learn to give to those and to grow that network. And what it did was it introduced my kids to the seniors, so they weren't strangers. And that back in the day, it was always Mrs. Graham,
Sure.
Mrs. Carty,
Sure.
But the thing that was interesting, and I share this, is that when their birthdays and Christmas came, those seniors gave my kids better gifts than I could have gave.
Sure.
So what goes around, people understand there are certain strengths that each one of us have. How do we share those strengths? How do we serve our community? And how do we grow? And that's one of the things that my mother, my grandfather, and my grandmother taught me.
Let me close, Debbie Montgomery, with you showing this picture, this great book you've got. You were honored at the University of St. Thomas recently. Talk about that in general, that event, and then let's show the picture of you when you first started as an officer.
By a young, one of the writers for my alumni magazine. And he said, well, we wanted to interview for a short article. And I said, okay. So he came over to my house and he sat down. He interviewed me for 2 hours. And he left. And about an hour and a half later, he called and he said, I think there's more to you than you shared. Can I come back? So he came back a couple of weeks later and interviewed me for another hour and a half. Then he wanted to meet somebody I worked with, grew up with, and went to school with. And so he interviewed them. Then he came back. He says, can I interview you again and bring a photographer? And I said, okay. I asked him, was this his PhD paper? And anyway, he wrote this nice 6-page article talking about, he listed it St. Paul's finest. And then he took a picture of my rookie picture that I have when I came on. And then they took a picture of a street that's on Marshall Avenue that's named Debbie Montgomery Avenue. And then he took a picture of where my house was and 94 is now. They took my grandparents' house to build 94 on St. Anthony and Chatsworth. And but he wrote a great story. And anyway, it was interesting. The University of St. Thomas sends out to the alumni, 86,000 people got this, and they asked at the end of every year the best article. And this article, for him, he got the best rating of all the articles that were written in the magazine quarterly.
Well,
So-
you've got such a powerful story. Debbie Montgomery, thank you so very much. Thank you for your service. Thank you for being here for this webcast, and thank you for the vision and the inspiration that you provide. And you can join us again next week. All next week we'll be interviewing other leaders in the community at 3 o'clock every day through the week. But also, I invite you to, if you want to experience interviews with civil rights leaders from Minnesota and across our country, visit Comcast's Voices of the Civil Rights Movement platform. It's available for free at civrightsvoices.com. I'm Al McFarlane. We'll see you Monday.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, this was great, great, great.